I'd just like to firstly welcome you here today for our session on the impact of feral animals on our biosecurity and the risks that they cause. Today is a very important topic and something that we're really keen to go through with you, and hope you can interact and ask some great questions for this session. My name's Penny Keynes. I work for Livestock SA. And for those who don't know, Livestock SA is the state farming organisation that represents sheep and cattle producers, and goat producers as well, to sort of improve the production environment and the way that things are for producers. So that's the activities that Livestock SA is involved in. But my project and the work that myself and my colleague Mandy are doing is around biosecurity and traceability, and that's why we're here today. So very keen to talk about this very important topic. We've got some great presenters online today, and you'll see Brad Page and Jeremy Rogers, who will both speak today. The reason why we're here today is because we've got some funding from the SA Innovation Drought Hub to deliver a biosecurity project to improve on-farm biosecurity, so that it contributes to better resilience within our industry. I guess a lot of people question about why drought and biosecurity should be linked and changing climates, and it really is that there are a few contributing factors when we think about climate change, and biosecurity and the changing climates for biosecurity is really changing the way that that disease travels, and animals are infected with diseases. So climate change is more extreme weather events, and it alters the habitat and range of distribution of pests and disease, and spread and establishes in new areas. It decreases biodiversity, which leads to more invasive species, climate change, and changing land, which really does weaken our resilience of ecosystems, and increase our future outbreaks. There's also the shifting trade and travel patterns, changing land use, and all of these different things that are contributing to a more risky biosecurity space. And that's why this project has been funded, and we're working with that drought fund to be able to deliver this as a part of that project. So one of the questions we get regularly when we're going on farm or talking to producers is around biosecurity planning, is, well, what's the point if I do all of my best biosecurity and I have everything in place? If an emergency animal disease or animal diseases in general come from feral animals, what's going to save us? So it's definitely important, and we really need to be able to uncover some of the reasons and what we're doing to be able to protect our biosecurity plans, the things that we can do and control on farm in our biosecurity planning to be able to protect our animals from those feral animals and what they can spread. So tonight we're here to learn, and I'm here to learn with you, because this area is definitely one that I've been asked about, and probably haven't been as informed as I could have been on what some of these diseases can present, and how we're managing those feral animals that can link to that, can create that issue. So we've got two people from the Department of Primary Industries and Regions. So firstly, we'll hear from Brad Page. So Brad's the Principal Biosecurity Officer, and then followed by Dr. Jeremy Rogers, the Senior Veterinary Officer. At the end of each speaker, we'll have a short session of questions, but we'll save them all up till the end, and we'll do a little bit more of a Q&A to really cover off on anything that you want to talk about from Brad and Jeremy. So I would like to introduce Brad. So Brad Page, the Principal Biosecurity Officer, and he's just going to give us an update on feral animals and how they link to biosecurity and what's been done about them. So I'll get you to unmute, Brad, and share your presentation.
Thanks very much, Penny, and thanks everybody for joining in on a presentation that I've titled Managing Biosecurity in Places Infested with Feral Animals. And just to link it doubly back to the drought issue is we often get programs funded in drought times, and it's really critical. Pest animals have a lot of the same impacts that a drought do. And what we often see is that you can't control the impacts of a drought in the short term. You can plan for it in the future and you can make your farm more resilient. But in the short term, things degrade very quickly. Whereas pest animals, with really targeted programs, we can get on there and control them. And that's often when government programs come to the fore. Okay, so biosecurity risks. Now, there are any number of reasons to control pest animals on your properties. Disease is, and disease spread through exotic animal diseases is a really important one. But whether it's deer eating grapes or deer chewing on grapevines that are about to sprout, pigs ruining or eating pastures, or just animals getting in amongst your livestock and competing with the pastures. Feral animals also, of course, they attract poachers onto your property and they'll often leave carcasses like that one in the middle there. They're a traffic hazard. They do carry disease. And of course, you know, we know how much they need. A deer, a small feral deer eats about the same amount as 1.5 sheep would eat off your pasture. So in some parts of the state, for example, feral deer, we're seeing numbers of them that we're actually killing. These are not surveys. We're killing numbers of deer up to 100 deer per square kilometre. No one would stock sheep like that in any part of the state. And so to have these aggregations of feral animals, most of you would understand really clearly what they're doing to pastures and to native vegetation in those areas. I've got a picture here that I'll explain in a second, but the take home for this is the ideal scenario would be we would eradicate every introduced animal from this country. But of course, it's really expensive to do that, as any of you would know who've tried to do it on your farm or tried to do it in your district. This is a map of Kangaroo Island. Kangaroo Island was burnt in December, January 2019, 2020. About a good half of the island got scorched, and one of the few silver linings that came out of that was an opportunity to eradicate pigs off the island, the feral pigs. Now, the picture over on the left-hand side of your screen, that's the last known sow who lived on Kangaroo Island. That's taken out of the helicopter that had just shot her moments before. And on Kangaroo Island, we know that there are 2 boars left on the island. So over the past few years, this program's culled 875 pigs on the island. And we've been able to do that through that picture in the middle, which looks like a kids' colouring competition. That's a map of the helicopter track lines that flew over Kangaroo Island over a period of about a year. And they flew searching for pigs with really high-tech thermal imagery. But to give you an idea, just to eradicate the pigs out of there, it's about 65,000 hectares, cost a bit over $5 million. So it's a really expensive problem once these animals get established in the landscape. Biosecurity risks more broadly for feral pigs. We need to look at how do we manage feral pigs to reduce the risk that they have on industries, whether it's a particular farm or whether it's a whole industry. And this is a map here, the little dashed lines that we have, the feral pig distribution across the state. You can see the map's a little bit out of date because it's still got them infesting Kangaroo Island. And then the coloured squares are the locations of piggeries or of farms that have got pigs, even domestic pigs on hobby farms in some cases. But you can see what we try to do is we marry the distribution of feral pigs to places where we have big piggeries and then look at what we need to do. So if there's no feral pigs in the area, do we really need to manage the risk to piggeries that feral pigs might transmit disease to them? And this is some work we did with the pork industry in the state, trying to inform them on where they might need to put in bigger biosecurity barriers around some of their piggeries. Feral deer is a really topical one for us at the moment. Feral deer are ones that have been For about the last 10 years, government programs have been trying to reduce the impacts of feral deer. Really, this was on the back of producers like this guy in the middle down in the upper southeast, putting up massive fences solely to protect his pastures. Now, this is not a deer farmer. He's got a fence in there that's 2 metres high, but we're getting lots of people who were fencing out kangaroos and deer just to try and manage the impacts of feral deer on their pastures. And so when we're seeing people like this, of course, around that neighbourhood where we're seeing high numbers of deer, people's pastures are getting stripped. It gets really hard to rest a paddock. And of course, if in places like that, if we did get a disease that feral deer could spread, they don't respect boundaries. They certainly don't respect fences. They travel across those farms day and night. They would spread disease. And so on the back of that, government changed policies for feral deer, and we looked at we actually modelled and said, well, if we're going to deal with deer, what's it going to cost us? And that graph on the right-hand side of your screen shows across a 10-year program, which we've badged the feral deer eradication program. We've got the red scenario there, which is showing what would have happened to deer if we just had have left them to do their own thing over the next 10 years. And of course, their populations would increase. And that was with business as usual culling. So with normal government investment going into aerial culling, with landholders working their hardest to control deer, their numbers were still going up. And then what we said is if we actually put in some really heavy aerial culling for deer, we can take them down on that blue scenario. And over the next 10 years, our aim is to follow that blue line and get deer numbers right down close to zero. And so that's one of the ways that we reduce the risk of feral deers spreading disease around the landscape. And that's, of course, work we're doing with the landscape boards across the state. One of the interesting things that we have to do for things like deer is we need to work out what's their population natural rate of increase. And what we look at is if we look at an area, say all of South Australia, we know there's about 40,000 deer here. Most of them are in the southeast, down in the Limestone Coast. And we then say, right, if we're to make any difference to the deer numbers, we need to kill 34% of them every year. And it's no difference on your own farm. If you want to try and drive their numbers down, you need to knock off 34% of the deer that are in that area every single year. What we're aiming for in our program is to go way above that and try and get to around 40 to 45% of the deer culled each year over the first 5 years of the program. Second thing we look at is we look at how far deer move in a given day. And this graph on the right is a really interesting one, and it really surprised us. These are the tracking data from deer from around the country that we've been able to collate. And what it shows is along the bottom, it starts off at midday on the left-hand side. Then you've got midnight in the middle of the graph, and you've got midday on the next day on the right-hand side of the graph. Now, up the left-hand side, it shows how far the deer have moved. And this is about 30 odd deer that are represented in here to show what their average movement is. So we know that through the daytime, most deer sleep. They go to a place of thick scrub and sleep. So they're not, that's where, if we take that as where they started out from, by the middle of the night, they've moved out onto your pastures and they're feeding up on their pastures. But that's the average deer. Average deer is only moving about 600 metres from where it slept. And these are tracking data with GPS collars over many, many months for each individual. And what we found is this was just a repeated pattern, that long distance movements by deer were really irregular. Now, that's an exciting finding for all of us, because it means if we kill them, we don't need to expect that they're going to be migrating across the state anytime soon. And some of the other ways we've been trying to manage them is we've got this feeder that we're developing, which is trying to feed deer. We've got long-term aims of registering a new poison for deer that will allow us to kill them without having to shoot them. Currently, the only way we can do it is to either shoot them from the ground, or we can shoot them from helicopters, which is what I've got a picture of here. And this is certainly our major control tool that we're doing at the moment to reduce any of the risks posed by deer, whether it's biosecurity risks or risks to your pastures or risks to road users. This is our standard helicopter setup, where we've got a super high-tech thermal camera on the left-hand side. We've got two people with firearms, and then the helicopter pilot up the front right. Down on the Flurio, this program's been running now for about a year and a half. And down there, we operate the program over around about 30,000 hectares, takes in around about 80 farms, national parks, forestry, everybody's on board. And so far over the past, I think it's about 13 or 14 months, there's been about 2,500 deer killed. So it's a really exciting program. Producers down there are really seeing a difference to the numbers on their properties. Another really big biosecurity risk and a big program that government's managing, of course, is the dog fence. It's a 2,150 kilometre long fence that snakes its way across the entire state, ends up at Fowler's Bay over in the West Coast. Through your sheep industry funds and Commonwealth and state government investment, we're rebuilding 1,600 kilometres of that fence. That is one of our best biosecurity barriers in this state. It stops anything smaller than a rabbit, anything bigger than a rabbit from getting through, and it delineates the north and the south of the state, and it is one of our flagship programs that we're trying to deliver to protect the sheep industry in South Australia. We've also got a new program on wild dogs, which is starting up at the moment. It's funded by the Meat and Livestock Australia. And what we're doing is we're really working with producers to support them to work with each other even better than they do at the moment. So this program will be running workshops on how to control wild dogs, as well as how to increase productivity in dog affected areas. It's a 4-year-long program, and that'll be a really big one that we'll be doing in partnership with the landscape boards around the state. One of the new pests that is really an emerging pest, and the impacts of it are really becoming apparent, particularly on Kangaroo Island, are feral cats. Feral cats don't do much damage to sheep themselves, but what they do is they spread 2 particular diseases which are common in the wet areas of the state only. They're called toxoplasmosis and sarcoidosis, and these 2 diseases are completely reliant on cats to transmit them. And what they do is the cat's feces goes out onto your pastures, and when your sheep or other livestock eat it, toxo causes late-term abortions in sheep, and sarco causes carcass downgrades or even complete carcass wastage. It's extremely prevalent on Kangaroo Island, and the landscape board over there is leading a program to try and tackle feral cats to get rid of them off the island. It's a massive undertaking. It's a really ambitious project, but the impacts on producers over there are profound. And so that'll be one that'll be really spreading its wings over the next few years. I just wanted to put in some pest control principles at the end, which is really, I wanted to highlight, before you go in and look at killing pests to try and reduce biosecurity risks, one of the most important things you need to understand is how many pests do you need to kill to make a difference. It's really not worth your while starting a pest control program if they're just going to breed up next year. And the classic example of that is rabbits, but it's no different with feral deer. It's no different with goats, feral pigs. If you need to get rid of them, you need to understand how many of them are going to be breeding next year, and you need to target your program to make sure that you do it at scale that's going to have an impact. To do that, it is critically important that you work with your neighbours and you work with their neighbours, and you get a group together. And that's the work that the landscape boards can really help with, is to coordinate that pest control across various properties. It's really important that you use methods that work. And again, the landscape boards and PIRSA programs can help with that, and can give you advice and give you resources that will help you to make sure your programs are efficient and effective. And really the take home is that baiting is one of the most effective ways and the efficient ways that you can kill most pest animals. We've got registered baits for wild dogs, foxes, feral pigs, feral cats, rabbits, and of course mice. And as I said, we're working with a long-term aim of registering a new bait that we'll be able to use on feral deer and goats. And that was all I had for this one, Penny.
That's fabulous, Brad. And I think some really great principles at the end then. I know I was very interested in hearing about that percentage of deer that need to be culled every year. I think that's a really good reminder that if we don't keep on top of these things, it certainly can get away. And that principle of working with your neighbour is certainly something that we promote in biosecurity all the time, not just for managing ferals, but managing strays, animals and things like, stray sheep and cattle and things like that, and having those stray policies in place with your neighbours and working with your neighbours in that sense. So very, very good. I haven't seen any questions pop up in the chat. However, I might just lead with one that came through the registration process. So what is the plan for feral deer eradication in the Adelaide Hills, and who do I report deer sightings to?
To go to the last part of it, the feral deer sightings can go through an app which is called Feral Scan, and there's a particular part of that app which is for deer. It's also got a website on it if people would prefer. You can go to the web and you can report that. All of that information comes back to us, and we collate that, and that informs all of our programs. On the bottom of the Fluria, we're having a really serious attempt at knocking deer numbers down there. And we've got helicopter control programs that if anyone's in that area, they would know about what we're doing. Up around the Mount Bold area, the Landscape Board is leading control programs there. They've got both ground shooting and aerial shooting happening there. And then up in the northeast of Adelaide, up around Lower Hermitage and up into Humbug Scrub and around all those reservoirs, PIRSA and the Landscape Boards will be running aerial culling programs there in autumn next year. We are always keen to hear on where deer are, and if there are aggregations of them, then we will put resources in to remove them.
Great information. So next up is Dr. Jeremy Rogers, and Jeremy is a senior district vet officer with the the Department of Primary Industries and Regions.
Thanks, Penny, and thanks, Brad. That was interesting. I learned things too, and that's always good. If you could advance to my slides, if you wouldn't mind, Brad. Thanks. And this slide's a bit of a montage, and I guess the point here is we've just heard about some of the feral animals, but people might not think of some of the others that are there in the bottom corner there of kangaroos. It's important not to overstate or understate the risk of disease spread from feral animals. In some cases, people get pretty excited and think that the world's going to fall apart and the sky will fall down because of these animals introducing foot and mouth disease. That's partially true, but it's also important not to understate it and say, oh no, they don't really matter. They, as we've just heard, they do produce significant ecological and on-farm impacts for a lot of people, and it's important to manage them. So just moving around on that slide, the first slide indicates, you might, if you peer at it closely, you'll see a small ulcer on the bottom of the tongue of that cow, and that's foot and mouth disease. The point of the slide is how hard it is to see. Foot and mouth disease may not necessarily announce itself and say, here I am, and I'm a big nasty virus, and that's going to cause you a lot of problems. Particularly if you then run your eye down to the bottom right corner for me on those feral deer pictured there, feral goats and feral deer, they may in fact be infected with foot and mouth disease, but show very little signs. Now, how much they transmit it and what actual risk they are is another question. But the point is that not all animals express foot and mouth disease. For example, foot and mouth is the worst one. But not all animals will express exotic diseases in the same way. And many of our native species, for example, may in fact transmit it unknowingly on their feet or in other ways, and still be a fomite transmitter, as we call them, but not show any signs. On the other hand, pigs, you can see on the right-hand corner there, are highly susceptible and very much affected by foot and mouth disease. They're the worst affected species. But having said that, foot and mouth disease, which is essentially an economic disease, not one that kills a lot of animals. And Brad has talked quite appropriately about toxoplasmosis in cats, which is also, I might add, a human health risk. But one of the things about foot and mouth disease that folks don't realise is that it doesn't actually kill a lot of animals. The main impact of foot and mouth disease in Australia particularly is going to be an economic one. And that brings into the issue of if we don't control it, it will have major impacts long term in our country. If we do control it, it'll still have major impacts, but it'll be of shorter duration. So perhaps if we go to the next slide, Brad, if you may. Thanks. The purpose of this slide is to show you that species differ. I've already made the point that species are affected differently, but in this slide you can see depicted the amount of virus, that is, I'll just get rid of that, the amount of virus that's shed by, so the first one there is cattle, about 10,000 viral particles per day, and sheep are similar, whereas pigs you can see rocket up to about 100 million viral particles a day. Does that mean that feral pigs are therefore a much more serious risk of transmission of foot and mouth disease? And the answer to that is both yes and no. Yes, because pigs do spread a lot more, produce a lot more viral particles, therefore are more infectious. They also tend to be clustered in groups. So an infected piggery actually acts as a viral incubator and can spread a plume of virus by air over a period of time. And that's what was seen in the 2001 outbreak in the UK. On the other hand, infected sheep and cattle, as you can see on that graph, don't excrete as much virus. They don't excrete it for as long. And therefore, although there's still a risk of transmission of disease, it's not to the same magnitude as pigs. It gets a little bit more complicated because people then become worried and say to me, well, you know, I've got a piggery up the road from me and that represents a real risk to me, and I might have really good biosecurity, but are they going to infect me with foot and mouth disease if it gets in there? And my answer to that concern, which is a real concern, and I understand it, is that properly managed commercial piggeries in South Australia are actually very low risk of being infected. And the chances, if they're going to be infected, it's more likely to be from neighbours' sheep rather than the other way around. Access to these piggeries and therefore the opportunities for the virus to get into a well-managed commercial piggery is unlikely, and it's more likely to be picked up quickly and hopefully controlled there. Having said that, you know, I know I'm probably being a bit complicated, Pene and Brad here, but feral pigs do represent a risk. We know they do travel, particularly if people start shooting at them, they start moving down the waterways, and Brad's more of an expert in that than I am, and they'll happily carry some viruses and infections and things with them. So that's foot and mouth disease. Perhaps, Brad, if you could flick back to the previous slide, I forgot to mention other diseases that are associated with feral animals. It's not just foot and mouth disease. We see parasites. Keynes disease on Kangaroo Island, there was many years ago now, there was a lot of concern that that Keynes disease was being spread by wallabies and kangaroos on KI, of which there are a lot. That's why it's called Kangaroo Island. And the producers there were very concerned that they were the culprits. So we did look at we culled a few, about 55 from memory, kangaroos, and looked at them and found that very few of them had any evidence of Keynes disease in them. We could culture Keynes disease bug from one or two of them, I think. The point of that story is to say that any animal transiting your property and is not welcome, you know, it's not one that you invited onto the place, has the potential to spread diseases. But the fact is the majority of infectious disease is spread by people buying it in livestock. So feral animals are not no risk of transmission of viruses or even bacteria or parasites, but there's some risk there. Thanks, Brad. If we could go back to the next slide and then perhaps advance to the next one. Is there another one? No, that's the last. All right, that's probably all I need to say. I've probably been a little bit complicated, but the truth about feral pigs in particular with foot and mouth disease is, yes, they are a risk. We're very fortunate people like Brad and his team are controlling them effectively in South Australia. We don't have a lot of feral pigs in South Australia, but in other states of Australia that do have a lot of feral pigs and they're way out of control, it's a major issue for them about the transmission of African swine fever, classical swine fever, and foot and mouth disease all of which are just over the horizon in Northern Australia at the moment, and Japanese encephalitis too, for that matter. So, you know, they are a risk, they are a hazard. In South Australia, we're pretty fortunate that they're not so much of a risk, but there it is. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Pene.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think that, yeah, it's a quick overview to come through. We'll definitely be answering them. There has been one come through the chat to me there, Jeremy, and it's, what is the risk of sheep from KI transferring toxoplasmosis to other and other diseases to the mainland if they have it, if you're purchasing sheep from KI? And is it only cats coming from KI that would transfer it? So it's a two-part question, and I will leave you to answer that one and just a bit more about toxoplasmosis, maybe.
Good question, and I might get some help from Brad on this too. My understanding is that once a ewe has been infected with toxoplasmosis and aborted, then they're resistant, and they're not a carrier. Is there? Brad's nodding, so I'll get him to speak with more authority in a minute. Probably knows more about it than I do. Bringing a feral cat from KI to the mainland wouldn't be a good idea, and certainly cats are carriers and transmitters of toxoplasmosis, but the cat has to do its poos in an area where the sheep can eat it. It gets on grass. It's a fecal-oral spread. Is that right, Brad? That's my memory. So that cat pooing on the pasture where a sheep can eat it, that's naive and hasn't been exposed to toxo, could then abort. Also, that cat pooing in your garden and then you digging around in it could affect you with toxoplasmosis, and it's not a nice disease if it comes your way. So, Brad, have you got anything more to add to that?
Thanks, Jeremy. The only part I'd add is that toxo and sarco are on the mainland as well. The difference with Kangaroo Island is the density of cats. Even if you compare Kangaroo Island to the lower Fleurieu, study done about 3 years ago showed that there are roughly 10 times more cats per square kilometre on Kangaroo Island, and that's possibly because there are no foxes over there, and so the cats have got plenty of small mammals to feed on, and they seem to be going great guns. So yeah, the diseases are here. So the risk of moving sheep that may or may not be infected with a disease from KI to the mainland, the additional risk is very low. One of the things about KI is it just seems to be a really wet environment, which is really conducive to this particular disease, as well as having a high number of cats on there.
Yeah, and I can add to that. It certainly is. It certainly is on the mainland, and hay sheds are notoriously bad for feral cats. And on the mainland, I've seen a couple of breakdowns where the hay shed has got a number of cats in there, feral cats breeding up in there, and then spreading that hay out for animals to eat can cause an issue. So just getting on top of that is certainly worthwhile. So I guess that is the end of the formal session from Jeremy and Brad. I will just share a couple of slides of my own about biosecurity planning, because I think the key thing here is that we're all working towards having the strongest biosecurity in South Australia as possible. And so while having the concerns of feral animals are very real, as we've just heard from Brad and Jeremy, if we don't have our own biosecurity in place and the best things in place that we can do for our own biosecurity and our own biosecurity planning, then that's where we can come unstuck, and those are the bits that we can control. So it's certainly not something that, because there's feral animals around, it's worth ignoring it. So just to bookend this this little bit of session, I am just going to share a couple of key points about the top biosecurity tips that I think are the 5 key things that we need to be thinking about in our biosecurity. So firstly is knowing the risks. So doing a risk audit on your farm as to where potentially diseases might come in your business is a very worthwhile activity to do. Those risks might be different for different businesses and different from different areas as well. So the region you're in is certainly also going to impact the risks that you face. So it's not changing the presentation. It's interesting. So just doing a quick risk audit on your farm and using a table similar to this and assessing the likelihood versus the consequence and identifying the risk of the different aspects of your business is really important, and which hazards you might consider. And feral animals will definitely be one of those pieces that you might look at. Also where you buy your animals from, what different, basically any of your biosecurity plan section, consider it and look at it from this sort of risk rating. And if it does come under that very high area, then you have to do some urgent attention compared to something that might be a low risk and you just need to do some ongoing monitoring. So just know your risks is a really important one. There's obviously documenting it in a formal biosecurity plan is really important, and these are the 6 different components that we look at when we are doing our biosecurity planning. And you can see there that feral animals and the spread of weeds is one of the things. So when you're looking at your biosecurity plan, some of those things that Brad mentioned in his last slide are really important to create that plan that especially in a time when things are not going so well, you're in adversity such as a bushfire or drought or God forbid, emergency animal disease. Having these plans in place now and having thought through all of these different components of a biosecurity plan will really help you get through a lot better and also protect your business now. So absolutely worthwhile. Keeping records, so maintaining the accurate records of your health treatments, livestock movements and people movements will really help strengthen your biosecurity plan, as it really is a risk management tool, and it helps you to really be able to provide the information that you need to provide when it's required through your LPA. So livestock production assurance is what I'm talking about when I say LPA, which is a requirement for integrity from an integrity systems company when you're so the integrity systems company is the governing body of the NVD, and the LPA is what you need to complete to be able to get an NVD. So definitely worth making sure that your biosecurity records are up to date for that. The question of come clean, stay clean, go clean can be a bit difficult when you're thinking of the pest animals that are coming onto your place, because they're not walking through a boot wash. But when you're looking at your visitors that are coming in, whether that be your livestock agents coming to look at your sheep in your yards, or your contractor coming with his gear to put in a crop or put in some pastures, making sure that they're coming clean when they are on the farm, staying clean and going clean. So have a set of standards that you require people to achieve to meet their requirements, to meet your biosecurity requirements and protect your own business. This is another one around developing a farm map that really highlights what what areas are where people can access on your farm to be able to maintain a degree of control over and limiting where people can access, so that you don't get the spread of diseases into production areas. So as you can see in this example here, this was one of my old colleagues, this is one of the blocks at her farm, and you can see in the green, that's the cool zone where visitors may access the property and have minimum to no contact with crops or livestock. So that's her house. little or no action required, and it's not required to do a visitor logbook kind of thing when they come in. They're coming to the residence, so they're not going to be entering production zones. The orange was in her example is a hay yard. So it's a warm zone is where people and vehicles come and they access in order to drop off inputs and pick up product, etc. So you think of those as your sheds, your silos, your roadways, your stockyards, maybe your shearing shed. And these areas are limited to only people that are required to go in there, and they have a purpose for being there. So monitoring these areas is really important, because yes, there is a possibility that some of those weeds and pests might have actually got into those areas. So because you do have some traffic in that spot. The hot zone is the red zone, and that's where the main part of production is undertaken, where crops and your stock are grazing, and this is where you should really protect as much as you can. Restricting access is really important, and where practical, keeping people off those zones. Only people or vehicles who have a need to enter these zones should have access, and they really need to consider that previous principle of come clean, go clean, and stay clean when they're in those areas. So absolutely protecting those regions of your farm, and having that map sorted is a really valuable part of that. And then finally, and something that Jeremy might be able to help you with, is looking, checking, and asking a vet. Like Jeremy said in his presentation, foot and mouth disease may not come and say, "G'day, I've got foot and mouth disease," and your sheep might not come up and say, "Yeah, I've got foot and mouth disease," and you might need to talk to a vet about it. So just making sure that you are looking at your animals, and early detection is what's going to really help us get through a disease outbreak and some of these issues that may come onto your farm from feral animals. The quicker you get onto it, the less impact it might have in your business. So I'm not going to get too deep into all of these principles, but I think if you can all just remember to update your biosecurity plan, and look at that number there, the 1-800-675-888 number. If you could all, from this session, put it in your phone, that would be really valuable, because I think it's a really important aspect to have in, and something that you can really go to quickly. So if you do see something a bit unusual, you know to call that number. And then, yeah, so I think that's where I will leave this presentation. There's no harm in calling that emergency disease watch hotline at any time. So just make sure that you're getting onto that as quickly as possible. Just go back, Brad and Jeremy, to looking at the questions that came in prior to this session. So one for you, Brad. What are the impacts of foxes?
Foxes, thanks, Penny. Foxes obviously kill a lot of lambs in this state, and that's by far their most profound impact. They have biodiversity impacts as well. They'll kill recovering populations of quolls, wallabies in the Flinders ranges. We do a lot of baiting for them. They also chew the teats off cows. Sometimes when the cows are giving birth, they'll get that damage, and that's a disaster when that happens. And we know they transmit mange and hydatids, which is something that Jeremy knows a lot more about than me. But the really important thing for foxes is they are easy to reduce the impacts of them, and it's critically important with them to work with your neighbours and to work with your landscape board and undertake a baiting program which is effective. And it's a simple tool to apply. The baits work really well, and there are ways to reduce the risk to your own dogs and to native animals. They are of very little risk to native animals, but applied properly, you can really manage foxes very effectively on your properties.
Thanks, Brad. Jeremy, I might just have one for you now. I wonder which of the we've just got a question. Which of the animals are spreading lice? Is lice a concern, and how does lice come through to producers? Is some of these pest animals spreading lice?
Oh, yeah. Lice tend to be species specific. So sheep lice don't transmit to anything else pretty much except goats, and they're not as successful on goats. So do feral goats spread lice? Well, Brad might be able to comment on that. I wouldn't have thought so. We have done we've done a lot of testing in South Australia on shot feral deer, and some on goats as well, shot goats and feral pigs as well, looking for exotic disease in particular, but some endemic diseases, for example, Johne's disease. So the good news is that we basically don't detect much disease at all in feral populations. That's endemic diseases. So that's lice or Johne's disease or other things. So that might be helpful for people to know. It's a bit of a sigh of relief that it's unlikely that those animals will bring endemic disease like Johne's disease or lice or worms on your property. However, they certainly can transmit viruses, as we've talked about before. Worms and parasites, also other parasites, tend to be species specific. So I don't think lice are a real issue, but Brad mentioned mange in foxes, and many farmers and producers would know that their dogs will get mange if they crawl down a foxhole. And so that's a real nuisance. And some varieties of mange that foxes have can actually be pretty hard to get rid of as well. Does that answer the question, Penny?
Yeah, and just maybe touch on foot rot. Are other species
Foot rot.
carrying foot rot?
Yeah, yep. A survey was done recently with Brad's help, thank you, where people were concerned that foot rot, which is prevalent in higher rainfall areas in particular of South Australia, was that being spread by feral deer jumping off into people's properties and spreading it on their feet. So we actually sampled some shot feral deer. We couldn't find it. So again, it's possible that it is transmitted. In fact, it may even be likely if you're having 100 feral deer per square kilometre and that place has also got foot rot, then I wouldn't be surprised if it does transmit. But in general, no, we don't think that it transmits on feral deer or feral goats.
That's good news. One for you there, Brad. As deer are a biosecurity risk, why are they not declared feral in Victoria and classified as a game species with a permit required?
In Victoria, I hate commenting on other state governments' policies, but over there, obviously they have a lot of deer. They've got some massive national parks. The Alpine National Park is by far their biggest. And if you were to compare that to our state, our national parks and our state forests look like postage stamps compared with theirs. And over in their national parks, yes, deer are a game species and you need a permit to hunt them, and they're a valuable resource to the economy. There are about 1.1 million deer in Victoria. In South Australia, as I said earlier, we've got roughly 40,000 of them. And so the reason we have declared them here is even with just 40,000, they're having massive impacts where they're in high densities. But what we've said and what we have committed to is with just low numbers, we do have an opportunity to cull them. If we were to leave them for another 10 years, our modelling suggests there would be around 208,000 deer in the state. And so by the time it gets there, the cost to get rid of them magnify like you wouldn't believe. And so the opportunity we've taken, and the reason we've got a deer eradication program running at the moment, is because it's feasible. And in Victoria, the horse is bolted.
So if you're a deer, make sure you stay on the Victorian side of the border.
Absolutely. Time to run now.
Yeah. There was one here, Jeremy. What is being done practically about increasing the supply of large animal vets in rural South Australia? So slightly off the topic that we're talking about, you might be able to just provide a little bit of a detail about that.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure that I can provide much detail about it. It's a problem that's got many aspects, and many in my profession and producers that we serve too are concerned about that issue, Penny, and I think there are multiple causes of it. Everyone's got their opinion on that. What's being done about it? There's not. It's probably a bit difficult to do much about it, actually. On the one hand, veterinary practices that I deal with on a daily basis find it very hard to attract graduate vets or experienced vets, especially those experienced in farm animals work. So they find it hard to attract them, and as a consequence, their client base shrinks. So I think what can be done to people perhaps listening tonight, if you are a client of a clinic, a country practice, then give them some work from time to time. Encourage them, and especially the young ones, cut them a bit of slack, because they make mistakes just like I did when I started. So cut them a bit of slack, help them along, and encourage them to stay. Marry someone locally, and then they'll stay, and that sort of thing. So. That's one thing you could do. I think governments across the nation, across the world, it's not just an Australian problem, are looking at this issue. There's not where there's a vacuum, it's a kind of a law of nature, I suppose. And I'm waffling here, Penny, and I won't go on for much longer, but where there's a vacuum, then something will fill it. And what I'm seeing is that what vets used to do in the countryside and in the environment around us, other people are now doing a lot of those things. And in some cases, I have to say, doing it better than we did. I've been a vet for 42 years. So I see people now doing things better than I used to do them, and my colleagues as well. So there are services now offered by other people that vets used to do or should have done, but are not now doing, and other people have stepped into that. The important point, I'm sitting here with a government uniform on and saying that we need to know about exotic diseases. We need to know about what's happening, whether it's exotic or endemic, get a picture of what's happening, feral animals, feral people, not feral people, we don't want to know about them, but diseases. So if you don't know of it or you don't have a vet, then the PIRSA does. We want to hear from you, and get in contact with someone who does come and visit your farm and tell them. If it's a nutritionist or a neighbor or a stock agent or something, and you're having a problem with livestock, as I said before, an exotic disease may not announce itself all of a sudden. We need to know. So tell someone, and eventually the message, we'd like you to tell us straight up. But there are other sources out there now, Penny, that I think are doing a good job of being our eyes and ears where vets used to be. That I'm not sure if that waffle is helpful for anyone, but that's my thoughts.
Appreciate that, Jeremy. So that's nearly our time. Jeremy and Brad, do you want to have any last comment, or you've said enough before we finish up?
Oh, look, Penny, the only thing I'd add is we can always tailor programs. There is support in PIRSA and in landscape boards in particular to help producers to work together, and that is the most critical part of any pest control program. So if anyone's got any questions, PIRSA Biosecurity has a general phone number. If people can Google us, we've got really good web pages, and we've got contact details of actual people, not you won't get put through to a panel, and you can speak to our staff and they will do their level best to try and find the support that's out there to be able to help producers with any pest or weed problem that they've got on their property.
Thanks, Brad. Yep, great comment. Livestock SA is also working very closely with PIRSA to be able to provide that support, and we'd also be able to refer you on to Brad and his team if you wanted to come through that way as well, because you've got my contact details. Jeremy, anything from you?
Just one last comment to Brad, back up Brad. If you shoot feral something on your property and it looks diseased, we'd love to know about it, either through Brad or through your vet or your neighbour or somebody. But we are curious. We want to know if they are spreading diseases, and if you see one that you think doesn't look right, then we'd like to know so we can look into it a bit more closely. Thanks, Penny, and thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I'll wrap up now. Thank you all for attending. A big thanks to Brad and Jeremy for presenting tonight. The information they provided is invaluable, and I think just gives us a bit of bit of a overview of that whole space around feral animals and the risk they present to our biosecurity. And I think absolutely, if you do need to get in touch with us, get in touch with Jeremy, get in touch with Brad if you have any concerns and want to find out a little bit more or have something tailored to your business. Just before we leave, I'd also like to give you an offer. So Livestock SA, and through this funding from the Future Drought Fund and the SA Drought Innovation Hub project that we're doing, we actually have a one-on-one session. We can provide a one-on-one coaching type session with producers that want to do a biosecurity tune-up. So if you've got a biosecurity plan that you're not completely 100% sure about, but you want to talk to someone that may not be in government and would like to talk to either myself or Mandy, who you've seen online this evening, her face pop up, definitely give Livestock SA a call, have a chat with myself or Mandy, send us an email. We'd be more than happy to help run our eyes over your plans and help you just tweak it or improve it. Or if you need to start again and make a new one, we can give you suggestions for the best platforms for those biosecurity plans to be created on, and actually make those plans not just a plan that sits in on the shelf, something that we can actually put action to and really tighten up our biosecurity to be able to do everything within our control to protect ourselves against the risks that are out there, because we know there are plenty. So I'll leave it at that for this evening. Thank you again. I can't state enough that the time that you've put in today, it means a lot to us, and we're really, really grateful for you attending and providing, finding out more about this very important topic. So have a great evening. 6 o'clock, right on the knocker. It's lovely to finish on time. Thank you all. Thanks again. Bye.